Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to my second part of my 20th Century China series, if I can call it a series. If you haven't had the chance, I would strongly recommend watching the first part of these two lectures, one that deals with China from 1900 to 1949, because it really helps us understand where the Chinese Communist Party is coming from, what challenges they faced in order to come to power by 1949, and also the kinds of promises that they had made the people of China at this point. One of the many things I find interesting about this period in particular is that Mao Zedong had basically inherited a country that had never been nationally unified under one government before. You'd always had sections of China controlled by various warlords. There had been a history of warring. Even the dynasties, the Manchu dynasty, part of the reason they fell apart was for the simple fact that they couldn't get that sense of national unity. And certainly Sun Yat-sen was heading in that direction. But it takes until the Communist Party comes in 1949 before that begins to happen. I always say when it comes to leadership, and when I always say that when it comes to government, that it's always very easy to be out of power and proclaim all the wonderful things you're going to do if I come to power, than it is to actually come through on those promises once you become the leader. And I think this is in many ways why people become so cynical sometimes about politics, because they say, oh, here we go, so-and-so is promising to lower the tax on beer, or to, increase, stat holidays, whatever it may be, It's easy to become very cynical about leadership when you see time and time again a pattern of people making promises and then not fulfilling those promises when they come in. Well, I can only imagine what Mao Zedong and the communists were going to face in 1949, because I don't think it's an easy task to try to unite a nation that by 1949 was somewhere between 500 to 600 million people. 80%, of course, who were still peasants. So, yeah, we'll just have to have a look here. And, this period in particular, the period from 1949 to 1976, sees such a tragic ebb and flow of policies that sort of draw the Chinese people. You got to consider that people adored Mao Zedong in 49. They were willing to do whatever he wanted them to do because many people adored him. He didn't have to rule out of fear, although the fear comes later. He wasn't, on the surface, a brutal dictator in the same way that Joseph Stalin was, although his policies led to millions of deaths as well. So it's a very difficult thing to quantify, and oftentimes I've seen many general statements made about Mao being one of the worst dictators. I believe that a lot of the things he did were by error, were errors in judgment. Until we get to the Cultural Revolution, that was pretty intentional. But by no means did I think he would have expected policies like 100 Flowers or the Great Leap Forward to lead to economic ruin as they did. So we're going to talk a lot about how Mao faces these challenges and how his leadership begins to evolve through that very dynamic period, that 27-year period between 1949 and 1976. All right, so basically what he does is he's going to reach out to his peasant base. I mean, his version of Marxism, Maoism, is its own ism. And the fundamental difference between Maoism and Leninism is that Mao believed in the supremacy of the peasantry. The peasantry was his loyal base, and that the revolution needs to continue to be revolutionary. The revolution should not reach thermidor, to use a term that came out of the French Revolution. When a revolution reaches thermidor, basically what that means is that it ceases to be revolutionary. That, at some point a revolution has to stop being revolutionary and needs to get on with business. It needs to get on with economic policy and fulfilling and satisfying the needs of the people. The American revolutionaries understood that. The French did. Even the Bolsheviks for a period did under Lenin when he implemented his new economic policy. That was a policy that gave incentive programs to people so that they could accrue a bit of personal wealth and begin to have the desire to work harder. So a revolution needs to be revolutionary for a period of time, and then it needs to reach a point where it gets on with business. So for Mao, that is sort of where he's at, this permanent revolution, to use a term I think coined by Leon Trotsky. That was his platform when he was struggling against Stalin for leadership in the Soviet Union. So what Mao does is he says, we're going to put we're going to encourage peasants to punish landlords in their areas as they see fit. So if your landlord was a real bad guy, punitive, brutal, the peasants are going to be brutal to him. And there were many executions of landlords in the countryside. However, there were also examples where landlords maybe weren't quite as brutal, and when this revolution happens and Mao takes power, they might come out and say, hey look, you know what, I get it, my family has exploited the people for generations, I've seen the light, please, you can have my home, you can have the land, just allow me to be part of this incredible experiment. And depending on the circumstance, some might say, yeah, okay, you are an enlightened son of a landlord, right? And then they move forward from there. So there was a way of saving your skin, but for the most part there was a real letting out of anger and frustration. So there were executions all across the country of landowners and tenant farmers, or tenant leaders rather. Remnants of the Kuomintang were purged from China, but most fled to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek. You might recall in that 27 Civil War, that 27-year Civil War, that the Kuomintang and its hierarchy and leadership and those people that supported the Kuomintang went to Taiwan and formed the Republic of China. Women were declared legally equal and arranged marriages were discouraged. Well, if you want to get 50% of the population on your side like that, that's how you do it. And so there was a tremendous amount of support for Mao from women. The idea of not being beholden to an arranged marriage anymore was pretty remarkable, that you could marry the one you loved. What a novel idea that is. Also, the bound foot phenomenon was also, as a practice, abolished by Mao Zedong and the communists. Bound feet is a very strange cultural phenomenon. Basically what it was, and it was usually relegated to sort of the upper classes, but when women were born, their feet would be tightly wound up, very tightly, and over years their feet would grow quite deformed, and they would become almost kind of helpless in a way, because they'd have a hard time walking and moving around. So I guess it was deemed as kind of attractive, because then these women would be more in need of the husband than in any other case. Now, I don't want to simplify this cultural practice nor disrespect it, but from a Western perspective, the bound feet phenomenon was a very strange one, but I'm sure many women were quite glad to have that cultural practice eliminated. Mao looked to the USSR for assistance despite Russian indifference during the Civil War years. There was no other communist country in the world other than the Soviet Union. I mean, Mao essentially was this, that's not true. I mean, Ho Chi Minh had established a communist leadership in North Vietnam, and I guess North Korea had as well. But I mean, in terms of a major player, the Soviet Union would have been the source of inspiration for all subsequent communist countries. So even though Mao was a little bit put off by the fact that they didn't get the support they felt they deserved during the Civil War years, they would look to them for support. And when Mao was invited to meet with Stalin, apparently Mao spent several days in Moscow waiting. And I guess after a couple of days, Mao was just irate that he was made to wait like this. And in the meeting when they met, you can see that there's this considerable amount of tension between Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. And I don't think really Joseph Stalin liked the idea of there being any sort of major competition to their leadership in the communist world. Maybe that was part of it too, who knows. But the Korean War I'll look at in another lecture, and I don't want to treat it as a footnote, because by no means is it a footnote, but for our purposes, basically, when the Korean War happens, of course, it occurs from 50 to 53. North Korea invades the South. And when MacArthur pushes those troops and the UN gets involved, he pushes the troops all the way up. He's told to push the North Koreans out of South Korea, which he does, but he decides to keep going. He's approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. China gets nervous, understandably. You know, they're a year old, and here come the UN troops, so they invade and push the UN troops and MacArthur all the way back. There is a tremendous amount of pride. The Korean War in China, from the Chinese perspective, was a great solidifier for Mao, because, you know, he'd been in power for a year, and he was able to implement this massive propaganda campaign, rallying the people behind the cause of defending, you know, China. And so in many ways the Korean War was a good unifier for China's government at the time. The intense use of mass media, education, campaigns, terror, and propaganda allowed the communists to create absolute power in China. The methods in which the communists used to take control of their society was classic textbook totalitarian style tactics. You know, this is where the oversimplified idea of communism and fascism being the same, this is the element of where you can see those commonalities. I mean, you get sort of, you know, you get a propaganda ministry that they're going to control what people read, what they hear, what movies they watch, what plays they go to, what books they read. You know, there was a massive effort on at the hands of the Communist Party to really make sure that everybody kind of only read the propaganda of success of the Communist Party. So pretty clear what was going on there. All right, where are we? There we are. Okay. Despite some of the more totalitarian leanings, if you will, of Mao's initial implementation of economic policy, there is no question that he was a very, very popular figure. He had been in the landscape of China, a known figure since the early 20s. He was the leader of the Long March, which was, of course, revered as a great thing in Chinese history. So he had a very populist, nationalist appeal. In addition to that, he was very, very intelligent, well-read, and despite the tone of his voice, which is a bit strange, he was a great communicator, and he knew how to use his words, and he knew how to project that image to the Chinese people. And so after the period of 49 to 55, there begins a process where Mao begins to think that I'm going to get the Chinese people actively involved in determining or suggesting future policy. Let 100 flowers blossom and 100 schools of thought to contend, he would say. On initial euphoria and public enthusiasm for the communists, Mao implements a policy of encouraging constructive criticism of the party. Okay, so he's asking people on the ground, write a little note, make a suggestion, what can we do to make our economy more efficient, and put it in these boxes. So there'd be these little boxes where you could put these little notes. And they began to collect this information and collate it. And in the process of allowing people to make constructive criticism, if you will, people in China in 55, 56 really felt like there was something truly egalitarian about what they were experiencing. They were feeling like they were part of something. And when criticism began to veer at party corruption and inefficiency, Mao shuts down the program. This is the great turning point in the populism of communism. Because what happens is he gets so angry at the kind of constructive criticism he gets that he lashes out. Some believe that the 100 Flowers campaign was like putting a piece of cheese out in a trap, waiting for the mouse to come and get the cheese, and then you grab them, right? I don't believe that Mao had that he wasn't thinking that way. He was thinking, we're going to put it in the hands of the people, we're going to get constructive criticism, we're going to change policy accordingly. But once people were critical of the party itself, then he got very angry. And what he does is those people in positions of power, not necessarily just regular merchants or peasants, but intellectuals and officials who spoke out in 100 Flowers were punished and labeled as rightists. That's what I mean. Leaving the cheese out for the enemy. And when they get that cheese, you snap them up, right? So what you see happening are these like public show trial type things where people have to defend themselves in a public forum. And this happened on universities, And you'd say, look, all I said was that we need to be more efficient and maybe the communists could do this. And then people would stand up and shout, traitor, traitor, counter-revolutionary. And, in many cases, these people would just be removed from their job and disgraced. They weren't necessarily executed, but there were incidents of violence where people who were generally disliked anyway would be treated more harshly than others. The resulting AntiRightist campaign would see 1 million people condemned. So this was supposed to be let 100 flowers blossom and 100 schools of thought contend. And when it did, he punished those people who he didn't like what they said. It's interesting. Mao assessed that 10% of the population were rightists, and many were struggled against in public forums. When Mao makes a general statement like this, 10% of the population are rightists, it filters down into the communities as people saying, geez, 10%, that means we need to fulfill this quota. We need to round up 10% of our local population as rightists. Which seems absolutely crazy. But that's basically what happened. People felt that they needed to ensure that this 10% quota was fulfilled. So a lot of people get thrown under the bus, I think, unfairly during the anti-rightist campaign. Well, from one grandiose policy to the next, from 100 flowers, we go into the Great Leap Forward. What a great sounding slogan that is, right? Mao loved these big, heavy-handed slogans. And of course the imagery, the use of socialist realism is still in full swing at this point too. And it becomes even more intense during the Cultural Revolution. Plans to make China equal to the West in 15 years, but also a policy to reinstill communist values which Mao felt were waning after 10 years of modernization. This goes back to the idea where Mao believed the revolution needs to keep being revolutionary, because if it stops and it reaches Thermidor, people will go soft, and then what happens to his revolution, right? So, peasants were encouraged to refine steel and increase industrial output by mining coal and iron, and to set up their own blast furnaces and set up vast cooperatives. He's asking peasants to come together in these massive communes and to refine steel on their farms using like bricks and homemade furnaces. And what ends up happening tragically is people boil down, or they smelt, what's that, I'm not sure the term, when you take the iron and then you melt it down. Take all this useful equipment, bicycles, shovels, picks, hoes, you name it, they're thrown into these things, they build new ones, and of course because it's not well made, the new stuff they make ends up falling apart. So it's a really strange, weird circumstance. Most were enthusiastic, but the program was very poorly planned, and the Great Leap Forward had tried to accomplish too much too fast. The tragedy of the Great Leap Forward is that people were willing to do whatever their great leader wanted to do because they loved him so much. Oh, you want us to do this? Great, we'll do it. You want us to make steel? Great. You want us to produce 100 bushels of wheat a month? We will make it happen. And that's the other side of the Great Leap Forward, is what he does is he encourages peasants to till as much as they can. And because he wants to publish and identify people who have produced the most amount of wheat per month. So people get very competitive. And once the top commune, says they've grown 100 bushels, the expectation is that every commune, regardless of how many bushels they have grown in that month, are expected to give that much. And what ends up happening is that the communists end up taking more wheat from the peasants than what they basically have for them. I mean, they're leaving very little for themselves. And what happens is you have this crazy, weird culture of competing communes, but then you have a situation of really bad weather in 58, 59, and these terrible economic decisions, which are kind of improvised, and these kinds of decisions can't be made on broad, sweeping slogans that people blindly follow, and that's what happens. What happens is a combination of these policies, poor weather, and bad conditions, and even drought in some parts of the country, you see massive famine in the countryside. Millions of people died. They had never seen anything like this in Chinese history on this scale. And as you can imagine, there's a rumbling in the party. People are beginning to say, I can't believe what what the heck is he doing? Nobody would have ever dared to come out and criticize Mao directly, because that was always, you didn't want to stick your neck out like that, because who knows what would happen to you then. But I think Mao recognized that he'd made a mistake, and he was half-heartedly willing to take some responsibility for it. And how he takes responsibility for the Great Leap Forward is not by admitting that he made mistakes, but it's by saying that I am going to retire. I've been in politics for 30 some odd years now. And I'm going to retire as the chairman of the party, and I'm going to pass on economic responsibility, if you will, domestic policy, to two young guys in the party who'd been around for a while, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Okay? And even though he does take part of the blame, and I know I said he didn't, but I mean he does by basically saying he's going to pass on leadership to some new guys. He resigns as head of state in 1958. He passes duties of economic development to Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai. There's Zhou Enlai here, Deng Xiaoping, and as I said, Liu Shaoqi. Okay, so he's going to semi-retire. He's going to go into the countryside. He's going to read the Chinese classics. He's going to write poetry. He's just going to relax for a bit and kind of step back, which I think was the right thing to do. But what happens is these three guys are more influenced by Lenin's new economic policy than anything else. And Lenin's new economic policy was the one where he implemented incentive schemes to get the economy going. So they implement these schemes, increase leisure time, renewed focus on consumer goods, and relaxed production expectations. Well, what do you think happens to output? It goes through the roof, right? The economy begins to really, really grow. And even in the agricultural sector, peasants are allowed to keep a percentage of their crop. So if you keep 10%, the more you till, the more you keep, basically. Between 1961 and 1964, China's economy made enormous progress, but government officials were beginning to behave like a privileged ruling class. So you get a situation where the economy is doing very, very well, but then those people in positions of authority government bureaucrats are beginning to take bribes. You know, the ugly consequence of market economics and capitalism. You know, give me a little here, a little there. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. That begins to happen. Now Mao, watching on the sidelines, grew very angry with the bureaucracy and the effective incentive programs on his communist dream. Okay, it gets very, very interesting. Mao is in retirement watching this. Now, on one level, you might think he'd say, wow, this is great. Your policies are producing all this wealth for people. People are happy, they're healthier, they're eating better, they're living better, they're more excited about life. And yes, there is an element of corruption. We're going to deal with that element. Instead, Mao looks at these reforms and he says, wait a second here. Does this mean that the last thing everybody will remember about me and my policy is the failed Great Leap Forward? What do these advancements, what impact does it have on my legacy? What I believe this was really all about, because Mao could say that the revolution was ceasing being revolutionary. You can't let that happen. I believe it was more that he was bitter and jealous that these two had very effectively got the economy going. And resentment, jealousy, and bitterness would have Mao launch what he called the Cultural Revolution in 1966. A massive upheaval. Remember, he had retired. Now he's going to come back. Both Liu and Deng are fired from their positions because Mao had the authority to do that. Liu dies after years of torture in 1969. Deng is sent into exile, and Zhou takes a cautious course as a cultural revolution begins. Liu Shaoqi, leader of China, ends up becoming the butt of all anger. Is imprisoned and tortured. Deng Xiaoping is sent into exile. Deng Xiaoping's son, just by being his son, is thrown out a window, and where both of his legs were ruined, and he was a paraplegic. And in fact, he would become one of the leading figures in support for people with special needs in the post-Mao period. But and Zhou Enlai just kind of kept quiet and was very cautious as things began to turn. Now, remember we talked about campaigns. Well, this is the new one. This is a big one. This is the most fascinating and the most troubling piece of Mao's leadership. And once again, built on conformity, slogans, images, socialist realism. Mao publishes his Little Red Book in 1964, which is a collection of quotes from Mao. Basically, what does that say about him? Here's my best quotes. I'm going to compile my best quotations in a book, and I'm going to pass it out to the People's Liberation Army, and you're going to memorize them and quote them like scriptures out of the Bible or something. So, Mao wanted the revolution to continue. He felt it had stopped due to reforms. It had reached Thermidor, as we said. In May 1966, Mao asked the young to attack party officials who had grown apathetic to Mao's vision and told them to rid the country of the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old ways of life. Okay, let me pause for a moment here. I want to clarify this. What Mao does is he goes down to the young people, those people who had no memory of life before Mao. Mao was a godlike figure to these young people. He goes to them, teenagers, and says, I want you to continue my revolution. Throw out all those who have oppressed the revolution. Go after your teachers. Go after everybody in society. And what Mao unleashes is a movement of incredible violence, because you have allowed and encouraged young people to be brutal. And what Mao hoped would happen is that they would overthrow these communist bureaucrats who had become kind of lazy and fat, if you will, by the era of reform of the early 60s, and that they would implement and put in new people who were revolutionaries. So very revolutionary. In 66, schools and universities were closed down so young people could get revolutionary experience and get direct leadership from Mao himself. There's no school in September 1966. They're all going out, you know, breaking down walls and destroying museums and going on their own long marches and seeking to get revolutionary experience from Mao. I mean, it was madness. Red Guard units spring up and begin criticizing those seen as revisionist, and Liu Shaoqi becomes enemy number one in this movement, right, as the lead number revisionist. Mao condemns Liu as a counter-revolutionary and China's Khrushchev. Khrushchev absolutely thought what was happening in China was madness. In fact, he spoke very disparagingly of Mao in his autobiography. It's called Khrushchev Remembers. It's a really interesting read. You know, he had no sympathy for China's path to socialism at all. And in fact, those two nations would nearly go to war in 1969 as well. So, Red Guards were given a mandate to destroy those believed to oppose Mao's vision. Okay, well, who's that going to be? Who's going to be destroyed? Well, people in the community that people didn't like. If you were a professor at the university that was known to be, you know, hard and difficult and uncompromising, you're going to be dragged out of your classroom and you're going to be struggled against, it was called. You were struggled against. You'd have usually these boards put on around your neck that says, I am a traitor to the people, and then you'd have to, you know, stand in front of a group of people shouting and raising their fists, and you'd have this heavy board. You could just, the blood would begin to drip off their neck, and, you know, it was just a horrible, horrible public humiliations. Liu Shaoqi's wife was dragged out of her home and dressed up like a prostitute and paraded in front of radical Red Guards. I mean, it was just madness. From 66 to 69, near civil war and chaos ensued. The economy faltered, and Mao had to demand the Red Guards to stop. Young people were then sent to re-education. What happens is when groups of students begin to create their own Red Guard units, they put on these red bands and they have their little slogans on it. Everybody created their own version of a Red Guard unit. We are the true representation of Mao Zedong thought. Mao Zedong thought were the ideas that came out of his little red book. So what happens is you get infighting amongst Red Guards where there's actually street battles and wars happening in the cities. And Mao finally, by 69, realizes that chaos is descended on the country, and he has to tell these young people, who he himself is personally responsible for radicalizing, guys, you got to stop. He was the only one that had authority to stop the Red Guards, which he does. Now you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young people who have been turned into rabid revolutionaries. And what does he do to deal with the problem? He sends them into the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants. Many of them are up in the countryside for 10 years. The lost generation, they're called, who don't come back to their old lives until after Mao Zedong dies. So it's a real tragedy for these young people who are just being kids and being, you know, impacted greatly by these broad sweeping policies of Mao Zedong, which is leading to chaos and disunity. Well, after years of chaos and near war with the USSR in 1969, Mao moves toward diplomacy with the US. Now what's interesting is we didn't necessarily really know a lot of what exactly was happening in China. China was very kind of isolated in the 60s at that point. We received some of the signals of propaganda that said, oh, you know, Mao's trying to keep his communist dream alive and and to extinguish counter-revolutionary. So there were, amongst sort of, you know, the new left, if you will, in the 1960s, you know, intellectuals in the West may have had a certain degree of sympathy for Mao, thinking, well, he's just, you know, being a good revolutionary. But when war nearly breaks out with China, between the Soviets and China, that's when Mao begins to say, wait a second here, what's the best way to keep the Soviet Union off our back? Because we got a border with these guys, and we don't trust them, we don't like each other. And Mao says, I've got an idea. Let's reach out to the Americans. Because if we can develop a friendship with the United States, maybe that will soften the Soviet Union. After years of chaos, Mao moves towards diplomacy, as I said. A rapprochement with the U.S. would result in restraint on the USSR. And he was sent, Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, is sent to Beijing to begin the communications. And you know, Henry Kissinger himself was an intellectual, and by all reports what I've read, he and Mao got along very, very well. They could have complex debates about philosophy and the enlightened thinkers and even Marxism, everything, right? So I think really when it comes down to it, it was Henry Kissinger who did the legwork for this, what would be known as the Shanghai Communique. Relations with the US and China have flourished ever since, although right at the moment, due to COVID-19, we are seeing a shift. And you know, up until the Trump administration, the relationship between China and the US, despite a few blips, including Tiananmen, had been pretty strong. I mean, the Chinese have been exporting loads and loads and loads of manufactured goods to North America. So this had flourished ever since, but I think we're going to see a shift coming up pretty soon. This was Nixon's last great diplomatic success before his collapse in Watergate. I'll come back another time. We'll do a lecture on Richard Nixon, fascinating character, and we'll talk in great detail about Watergate another time. But he's basically shuffled out of office. He resigns as opposed to being removed from office or impeached. And it's a shame because, you know, Richard Nixon, of course, the first thing you think of when you think of Nixon is Watergate. But unfortunately, he'd been quite successful in the fields of foreign policy and even domestic policy. So it's a bit of a tragic figure, I think, in that regard. So. Well, after Mao's death in 1976, Hua Guofeng becomes leader, but he is weak and unpopular. Hua Guofeng was appointed by Mao. Now, I wanted to mention, before I forget to mention this, there was a really great book written by Mao Zedong's former doctor. I believe his name is Li Jirsui. Pronunciation might need a bit of tweaking. But in his book, which I read many, many years ago when I was an undergrad, was a remarkable piece of writing because Li Jirsui made the argument and took the position that Mao Zedong was exhibiting signs of Parkinson's disease as early as 1960, which would suggest that during the height of his chaotic policies of the Cultural Revolution, which aren't reasonable or rational at all, that he may have been working under tremendous mental duress. So it's an interesting idea to think that he may have had this medical condition, Parkinson's, that was, of course, having a tremendous impact on his policies. But either way, he passes away in '76, and his appointee, who kind of looks like Mao, moves like Mao, dresses like Mao, is the new leader, and everyone's like, who the heck is Hua Guofeng? So, he does arrest the Gang of Four, but by 1978 he's shuffled out of power and Deng Xiaoping returns to a leadership position. The Gang of Four was led by Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing. And she was a fervent supporter of the Cultural Revolution. She wanted to keep that thing going, keep the revolution being revolutionary. But the thing was, the Chinese people, by Mao's death, had had enough of revolutionary upheaval. It was time for Thermidor. It was time for stability. And, you know, here's Deng Xiaoping, right? The architect of economic progress in the early 60s, who's sent into exile. He comes back, believe it or not. So anyway, these revolutionary Gang of Four are arrested, and then Deng Xiaoping returns to a position of leadership. Deng Xiaoping makes it very, very clear, and he never ever overtly criticized Mao personally, but he basically wants to completely escape from Maoist economics and moves towards more creativity in invigorating the economy. He wants to do what he did from 1961 to 64 with Liu Shaoqi. To encourage greater production, Deng offers new incentives like overtime, bonus payments, profit sharing. People were encouraged to start their own businesses. Pepsi was allowed to open up shop in China, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Nike, you name it. It will open the floodgates. Deng also restored examinations in universities and encouraged key schools for better students. You know, and the thing is for Deng, you know, a lot of people in the party are like, whoa, 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 what's going on here? This is far too radical a departure. You know, from Deng's perspective, if economic change was instigated by the Communist Party of China, that they were the ones pushing it along, then it was the success of the Communist Party. It doesn't matter. And he makes this quote. When asked by reporters, well, what's with all this market reform business? He says, well, it doesn't matter what color the cat is so long as it catches mice. Whatever we do is Chinese socialism. Call it what you want, but that's what we're calling it. Chinese socialism, right? And he also, his slogan, remember we had Mao's Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, 100 Flowers. Deng's is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And he said very clearly, socialism is not shared poverty, right? To get rich is glorious, I think he was also noted for saying too. Now he was a fighter. He was a little guy, 5'2". You know, his feet were off the ground when he sat in a chair like a child. But man, he was a man to be reckoned with. He was creative. He was charismatic, you know, well-liked, all those things. And he implements these policies of what he calls a socialist market economy. Interesting. The state claims ownership over large industries and uses market forces to increase production. The thinking amongst communists is that they need to create wealth by stimulating the productive forces. Socialism can come later. We haven't even reached the capitalist stage of our economy. We're still largely agrarian. We need to build up our industrial base and get the wheels of the economy going. That was number one. And in '79, in the spirit of economic restructuring, came a desire for greater political freedom, resulting in the Democracy Wall movement. This was kind of Deng's 100 Flowers. Because he knew that there was a lot of suppressed emotional scars that people were still dealing with as a result of the Cultural Revolution, because families have been turned upside down, people have been killed, people had turned against each other, it got really vicious. And he said, I'm going to allow people to go to these walls and you can get stuff off your chest by writing stuff. Well, like 100 Flowers, once you open that gate, all this stuff came pouring out, and Deng Xiaoping had to shut down Democracy Wall. So Deng supported it initially, but demands for free speech in a parliament angered Deng, and it was shut down and the movement was crushed. So like the Prague Spring in 1968 in Czechoslovakia or the Hungarian Revolution, anytime you're in a dictatorship that controls everything and you allow just a little bit of an opening, it's like people just want to bust out. And you're better off just to shut the door entirely. And that's what they do. Well, the rural areas were given incentives and allowed private plots. Production blossomed. In '79, Deng's one-child policy was implemented but received with mixed feelings. City dwellers were easier to police, but rural communities resisted. I mean, if you lived in a small apartment, you didn't want 4 children. You couldn't accommodate a big family. But if you lived on a farm and you had acres and acres of land, you wanted a big family because you wanted all hands on deck. You needed people helping with the tilling and everything. So it was more, the one-child policy was really resisted and resented by agrarian elements in society. He creates special economic zones where capitalism could be experimented with. The city of Shenzhen, he says, okay, we're going to experiment with market forces in that city. If you want to open up a business or invest in the stock market, you do it there. So young people would save their money, they go to Shenzhen, and that at one point in the early 80s was the fastest growing market economy in the world. Deng creates special economic zones, as we said. His 4 modernizations became the economic cornerstone of his economic policies: agriculture, industry, technology, and defense. So clearly, between the market forces, between the opening up of the economy, Deng is doing whatever it is to get the economy and the wheels of government going, wheels of industry. These policies resulted in dramatic growth, but in 1986, when students protested Japanese investment in China, demonstrations and protests followed. And in 1987, Hua Yobang, the party chairman, was dismissed by Deng Xiaoping for not dealing firmly with the protests, and as a result, Hu was seen as a leader who sympathized with the protests. So Hu Yaobang was shuffled out of power, and he becomes kind of a poster boy for the early movement of 1989, because he was seen as someone who wanted to open things up a little bit more, and Deng Xiaoping had him removed from power. Well, when you go from a command economy, a rigid Maoist economic system, to open the floodgates, invite all foreign investment, and allow people to make money, there's consequences with that. And inflation and unemployment created new problems. The Tiananmen Square protests were in large measure sparked by the death of Hu Yaobang in April '89, because he was the guy that the young people liked in '87, as many remembered him for being a moderate. Within the Chinese Communist Party developed elements who supported more political freedom to coincide with economic freedoms. Okay, there were those in Deng's government who said you can't open up the floodgates on economic freedom and then continue to suppress political freedom. Those two things have to go hand in hand. And of course, if you held that opinion in Deng's government, you would be removed. It's that simple. But there's no question that there were elements in China that believed that they needed to continue to move forward in opening up Chinese society. Well, and so the Tiananmen Square massacres were really the culmination of all these problems of inflation and unemployment and a lack of political freedom and so on and so forth. What triggers the events, though, or actually what really begins to move things along, was what was happening in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, what's interesting is that Mikhail Gorbachev was inspired by what Deng Xiaoping had done in the late 70s, early 80s. And he himself begins to implement his perestroika, right? Economic restructuring. But the thing is with Mikhail Gorbachev is he also implements glasnost, which means openness, right? Talk, debate, discuss, change things through discussion. There was no glasnost type system in China. So a lot of young people are saying, hey, that Mikhail Gorbachev guy, we like his perestroika, we also like his glasnost. The early protesters were inspired by glasnost. Protests began in April, and in May, Gorbachev came for a state visit. International media was there to record the event, but also found protests. But Deng was furious that the welcome had to occur at the airport, since Tiananmen Square was filled with protesters. Okay, so here's the thing. These protests were already happening. Mikhail Gorbachev is making a state visit. It is a big deal because these two nations had been at each other's throat for 30 years. This was like a relaxation in tension, so it's a huge opportunity for China and the Soviets. When Mikhail Gorbachev arrives, the international media is already there to report on this event. And when they arrive, Deng Xiaoping has to greet Mikhail Gorbachev at the airport. He couldn't put him in a car and drive him around Tiananmen Square, which would have been customary because the protests were there. So Deng Xiaoping was furious about that. The leadership of China hesitated in dealing with the protests because they needed certain loyalty of the People's Liberation Army, and they were concerned with the many foreign journalists in town during the Gorbachev visit and after. On June 4th, though, after Gorbachev had left and many of the foreign media, that's when the communist authorities clamped down. And they entered the square and declared martial law. So it is a square. And all the young people are in the square. So when the PLA and the tanks and the troops come, they're coming in all the entrances into the square. So there's nowhere for anybody to go. I mean, it's like Amritsar in India, that fateful event in 1919. Similar kind of circumstances where the army comes in and you've got nowhere to run. And people are running around and the machine guns are firing. And, this event, very well reported because it was on film. This young man tries to stop the tank column. He ends up climbing on top. Then he gets off and runs away. And the tank column continues. But he's like, hey guys, what are you doing? We're Chinese here. You can't do this. This is a Statue of Liberty, by the way, that the protesters in Tiananmen Square had built and brought into the square. So, and they were chanting slogans by Mao. Mao once said, by the way, that anybody who puts down a mass movement can only come to no good. Boy, oh boy, to use that refrain, right? So they're using Maoist refrains to, they never would have thought. The Tiananmen Square protesters never could have imagined the tanks coming in, I don't think. When the tanks came in, a huge era of repression continued in the early 90s, but economic reforms continued. So in terms of numbers, I don't know. Those who hate the Chinese communist system say thousands died. Those who are apologists died, or those who are apologists for the Chinese Communist Party say a couple dozen. I believe the Red Cross had quoted figures between 200 to 300. They're the ones I tend to believe. But either way, whether it's one person shot by the state or 200, it's still a crime. And, Deng Xiaoping is a tragic figure because he did so much for this country to move forward. But at the end of the day, his policies showed what the Chinese communist system was willing to do to maintain order and their interest in the state. So despite the fact that there was a tremendous period of repression in the early 90s, economic freedom continued and wealth continued to be generated. So, which is why even today that China is still an economy that is still on fire. But now in the age of COVID-19, where we're currently at in the spring of 2020, we don't know where things are going to go with China. And especially when it comes to the United States, with the unpredictable and temperamental behavior of Donald Trump, we have to be very, very careful. There's so many variables, and maintaining some semblance of a relationship with China, I think, is very important because they are a key player in the world economy. All right, that being said, I want to thank you again for having a look at my series. Don't hesitate to contact me or make a comment on my channel. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Take care.